One aircraft, one missile, one engagement that changed how the air war over southern Ukraine actually worked. The Russian A-50U Mainstay was orbiting at 32,000 feet above the Sea of Azov, flying lazy circles in the cold air, its rotodome spinning continuously, painting Ukrainian airspace with radar energy. From Moscow's perspective, this was untouchable, irreplaceable, safe. They were wrong on all three counts. What followed wasn't luck, wasn't improvisation, and wasn't a desperate gamble by a smaller air force throwing everything at a problem. It was the product of weeks of patient intelligence work, deliberate coordination between multiple Ukrainian military branches, and a level of tactical sophistication that caught Russia's most experienced radar operators completely off guard. I'm your host at Conflict East, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today we're breaking down one of the most consequential single air-to-air engagements of the entire conflict. A Ukrainian F-16 firing an AIM-120 AMRAAM at extended beyond visual range distances, threading between Russian fighter patrols and sending the crown jewel of Russian airborne early warning spiraling toward the Azov Sea. This wasn't just a shootdown. It was the deletion of a strategic capability Russia cannot replace on any realistic timeline. Every Russian pilot over southern Ukraine is now flying partially blind. Every Su-35 patrol, every Su-34 strike package, every Kinzhal-carrying MiG-31K operating in that corridor now does so without the system that made them feel invulnerable. But to understand why this strike mattered so much, you first have to understand what the A-50U actually does, and why losing it hurts in a way that 100 destroyed tanks never could. The bereaved A-50U Mainstay is Russia's answer to the American E-3 Sentry AWACS. Built on the Il-76 transport airframe, it carries a massive rotodome above the fuselage housing a surveillance radar capable of tracking hundreds of airborne targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding 600 kilometers. It detects low-altitude cruise missiles. It tracks fighters at extreme range. It feeds real-time targeting data to Russian Su-35S interceptors, letting them engage Ukrainian jets before those jets even know a threat is in the area. In practical terms, the A-50U is a force multiplier of enormous power. Without it, Russian air superiority in the south depends entirely on the individual radar suites of each fighter, capable enough in isolation, but nowhere near the integrated picture that airborne early warning provides. With the A-50U aloft, Russian cap fighters operate with comprehensive situational awareness. Every Ukrainian aircraft climbing above 1,000 feet anywhere in the operational zone is visible, cataloged, and trackable. Ukraine's Air Force had been operating under that ceiling for months. Their F-16s, acquired through intense diplomatic pressure and years of negotiations with Western partners, were still delivering combat power. But every mission had to account for the Mainstay's eyes. Routes were kept low, exposure times minimized, and anything resembling a sustained high-altitude profile was an invitation to a Russian BVR missile fired with precise targeting data. The A-50U wasn't just threatening. It was shaping every tactical decision Ukrainian pilots made. That had to change. The Ukrainian operation that eventually produced the Azov engagement began not in the cockpit of an F-16, but in the analytical sections of Ukrainian military intelligence. Satellite imagery and signals intelligence had been building a pattern of behavior around Russia's remaining A-50U fleet for weeks. By this stage of the war, Russia had already lost airframes to Ukrainian strikes. Earlier engagements had demonstrated that the aircraft, when caught in the right circumstances, was vulnerable. But Moscow had adapted. Flight paths had been adjusted to keep the remaining Mainstays deeper over Russian-controlled territory, outside the reach of most Ukrainian ground-based systems. The Sea of Azov orbit had become something of a routine. The A-50U would take off from a forward base, establish an orbit over the central Azov, and maintain coverage of the southern operational zone for 4 to 6 hours before returning. The orbit was calculated to stay well clear of land, at altitudes and standoff distances that should have made intercept impossible for Ukrainian fighters operating from land bases. Should have made. Because Ukrainian planners had identified something the Russians apparently hadn't fully accounted for. The AIM-120C AMRAAM, the Advanced Medium-Range Air-to-Air Missile, carried by Ukraine's F-16s, belongs to a different category than most of the air-to-air missiles in Russia's older generation stockpiles. The C variant reaches out to 105 kilometers in ideal conditions. The D variant, which Ukraine had received a limited allocation of through Western channels, pushes that effective range even further under the right launch parameters. A fighter climbing rapidly at high speed, launching from altitude toward a slow, large, non-maneuvering target, can extend the effective kinematic range considerably beyond the nominal figures. The A-50U was a large aircraft, slow. It flew predictable patterns. And on its established orbit, it was coming within reach of an F-16 that could be positioned correctly. If, and only if, the Russian fighter escorts could be decoyed away at the critical moment. That was the problem Ukrainian planners had to solve. Which weapon system gave Ukraine the critical edge in this engagement? Was it A, the AIM-120 AMRAAM missile, B, the F-16's advanced radar suite, or C, the coordinated electronic deception package? Comment your answer below. We'll break down each component as the engagement unfolds. The solution was clean and spoke directly to Ukraine's growing sophistication in multi-domain operations. They wouldn't try to sneak the F-16 past Russian cap coverage in isolation. Instead, they'd give Russian radar operators something more compelling to look at. The decoy profile would be flown by a Ukrainian MiG-29, operating from a separate vector and conducting what appeared to be a standard defensive patrol near the eastern Ukrainian coastline. Ukrainian electronic warfare assets would simultaneously activate in ways consistent with preparation for a strike mission, the kind of activity that draws Russian cap fighters east to intercept or shadow. Russian controllers, watching from ground stations and from the A-50U itself, would see what looked like a developing situation on one axis, while the actual threat approached from a completely different direction. Planning this operation required solving several significant problems. Timing had to be precise to within minutes. The F-16 pilot had to execute a profile that kept them below the A-50U's detection envelope for as long as possible, then climb rapidly to an altitude that maximized missile kinematic performance, fire, and dive away before Russian escorts could be vectored to intercept. The entire window from detection to missile impact had to be shorter than the Russian fighter response time. The intelligence team had one more piece. Signals collection had determined there was a gap in the standard Russian cap positioning on the southern axis. A window of roughly 18 to 22 minutes during each orbit cycle when the two Su-35S fighters providing close escort to the A-50U repositioned to refuel from a tanker. During those minutes, the Mainstay flew with its long-range radar but without immediate fighter protection. The gap was predictable. The Russians had grown comfortable with it. That comfort was about to cost them. Stay with me. What happens in the next 18 minutes of this engagement destroys Russia's most precious airborne asset over the Azov Sea. The clock was already running. The F-16 assigned to the intercept mission had been selected carefully. The pilot, referred to in Ukrainian sources by the callsign Sokil, meaning falcon, had accumulated substantial hours on the F-16 since converting from older Soviet-era types and had demonstrated strong proficiency in beyond visual range engagements during training exercises run with NATO advisors. More importantly, Sokil had studied the Azov orbit pattern extensively. He knew the A-50U's behavior. He knew the refueling gap. He had rehearsed the attack profile dozens of times in simulation. The night before the mission, Ukrainian Air Defense Headquarters received updated signals intelligence confirming the orbit schedule. The refueling window was projected to open at approximately 3:17 a.m. The A-50U would be at the farthest point in its westward sweep, closest to the range parameters that made an intercept geometrically possible. Ground crews prepared the F-16. Two AIM-120D AMRAAMs were loaded on the shoulder pylons, the primary weapon of the engagement. Two AIM-9X Sidewinders were carried for contingency close-range defense, a full load of chaff and flare countermeasures. The radar warning receiver was checked, rechecked, and checked again. Every system on the aircraft had to be functional. There would be no abort option once the climb began. At 2:51 a.m., Sokil taxied to the runway. At 2:54 a.m., the F-16 lifted off. The departure routing kept the aircraft extremely low, well below the altitude that would make it visible to Russian ground-based radar on the eastern axis. Ukrainian air defense controllers were managing the picture in real time, deconflicting Sokil's track from other Ukrainian air defense assets and ensuring the deception package was ready to execute on schedule. The MiG-29 decoy launched from a separate base 12 minutes after the F-16. Flying northeast at medium altitude, it began the patrol profile that Ukrainian planners had designed to look like a precursor to an eastern strike. Ukrainian electronic warfare vehicles activated in the Zaporizhia region, active emissions consistent with targeting support for a ground strike mission. The picture building on Russian radar screens showed activity on the eastern axis. Russian cap controllers responded exactly as anticipated. The Su-35S pair that had been holding in a loose orbit south of the Azov shifted their attention and positioning eastward. Both pilots were experienced. Both were competent. And both were looking the wrong way. How many AIM-120 AMRAAMs did the F-16 carry into this engagement? Was it A, 2 AMRAAMs, B, 4 AMRAAMs, or C, 6 AMRAAMs? Answer at the end. Pay attention to the weapon's loadout details as we continue. At 3:04 a.m., Sokil received the code word from Ukrainian ground controllers indicating the deception was producing the desired effect. The Su-35S fighters were repositioning. The refueling gap was approaching. The A-50U was continuing its orbit, its radar operators busy processing the activity they were seeing on the eastern axis, feeding targeting data to Russian CAP controllers who were increasingly convinced a Ukrainian strike package was developing. At 3:11 a.m., Sokil began the climb. The F-16 accelerated to supersonic speed and pulled upward sharply, transitioning from 500 feet above the wavetops to a missile launch altitude in under 90 seconds. The aircraft's AN/APG-68 radar activated, sweeping ahead, acquiring the A-50U's massive radar cross-section within moments. The target designation cursor locked on. What Sokil saw on his radar display was a large, slow, non-maneuvering aircraft at 32,000 feet, approximately 97 kilometers distant. The geometry was tight. The missile kinematic analysis in the F-16's fire control computer was calculating continuously. Range, aspect, target speed, target altitude, launch platform speed and altitude, atmosphere. The engagement envelope was marginal, but it was inside the outer boundary. Sokil had practiced this moment hundreds of times. The exact same calculation, the same discipline required to wait for the firing solution to stabilize before committing. Subscribe to Conflict East if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. We break down the engagements that shape doctrine for the next generation of military planners. The radar warning receiver on the A-50U almost certainly detected the F-16's radar emission at approximately the same moment Sokil achieved lock. The crew aboard the Mainstay would have seen a sudden threat indication, a fighter radar, active, in a sector that should have been clear. The realization of what was happening would have arrived in fractions of a second. Too late to matter. At 3:13 a.m., Sokil fired. The AIM-120D came off the shoulder pylon with a flash of rocket motor ignition. At its launch velocity combined with the F-16's own airspeed, the missile's initial energy state was exceptional. The active radar seeker in the AMRAAM's nose would guide the weapon to the target autonomously. Sokil did not need to keep his own radar locked on the A-50U for the missile to find it. That fire-and-forget capability was exactly what the geometry of this engagement required, because Sokil was already diving. The moment the missile was off the rail, he pushed the nose of the F-16 toward the sea, accelerating downward, dumping altitude as fast as the aircraft could manage. Within 30 seconds of firing, he was back below the deck of Russian radar coverage. The engagement window, the moment of vulnerability, lasted less than 90 seconds from the initial climb to re-ingress below radar coverage. The AMRAAM flew its programmed mid-course route, climbing slightly to conserve energy, its inertial navigation system tracking the last known position of the target. At a computed distance of approximately 15 kilometers from the A-50U, the active radar seeker activated, acquired the massive target independently, and began terminal homing. On the A-50U, the crew had approximately 45 seconds to respond from the moment the threat warning activated. They had no fighter escort in immediate range. The aircraft's own electronic countermeasures activated. Chaff dispensers releasing radar reflective clouds, jamming transmitters attempting to break the AMRAAM's seeker lock. The A-50U began a hard banking turn, the lumbering Il-76 airframe pushed to the limits of its maneuverability. A four-engine strategic aircraft with a massive rotodome and a maximum bank angle of approximately 25 degrees does not evade an AIM-120 in terminal homing phase. The missile impacted in the aft fuselage section, detonating its 22-kilogram continuous rod warhead in proximity to the aircraft's fuel systems and hydraulic runs. The explosion was catastrophic. Combat footage captured from Ukrainian drone platforms operating at extreme range over the Azov showed the initial fireball at altitude. A sudden bright bloom against the dark sky, followed by secondary explosions as fuel ignited. Debris trail visible for kilometers. The A-50U did not survive. Russian search and rescue assets responded within 20 minutes, but there was no aircraft to recover. Wreckage dispersed across a wide area of the Sea of Azov, with some debris eventually washing onto the Crimean coastline over the following days, documented by OSINT analysts tracking the debris field. The crew of the A-50U, estimates put the complement at 15 to 17 personnel, including the flight crew and the large complement of radar operators and systems specialists that the aircraft requires, did not survive the impact. Ukrainian sources confirmed no ejections were observed on the drone footage. The Su-35S escorts realized what had happened within minutes. Signals intelligence captured frantic communications between the escort fighters and Russian ground control, the Russian pilots pushing their aircraft south at maximum afterburner, arriving at the A-50U's last known position to find nothing but dispersing smoke and aviation fuel on the water. The language in the intercepted communications, according to Ukrainian sources who reviewed translations, reflected shock and disbelief, suggesting even the most pessimistic Russian Air Force planners hadn't genuinely considered this scenario possible. If you believe tactics win wars, and the evidence from this engagement makes a compelling case, type Conflict East in the comments. Sokil had landed safely at his departure base by 3:47 a.m., 45 minutes after the F-16 had taxied for takeoff. He was debriefed immediately by Ukrainian Air Force intelligence officers who needed precise recall of every sensor reading, every warning indication, every system response during the engagement. The debrief lasted 4 hours. The battle damage assessment that followed over subsequent hours and days used multiple intelligence streams. Satellite imagery of the Azov surface, signals intelligence showing the sudden silence of the A-50U's radar emissions, communication intercepts, and eventually Russian state media's conspicuous failure to explain the loss of a strategic aircraft. What Russia had lost wasn't simply one aircraft. Russia's A-50U fleet had been reduced through attrition across the full-scale invasion to a handful of operational airframes. Unlike tanks or artillery pieces, which can be manufactured and fielded in months, an AWACS aircraft represents years of production, specialized systems integration, and trained crews who cannot be replaced quickly. The radar operators aboard an A-50U spend years developing the expertise to manage complex air pictures. That institutional knowledge burned in the Azov debris field along with the airframe. What would NATO have done differently in planning this intercept? Would the engagement profile have included a second aircraft for mutual support? Or is the single-ship approach tactically sound for this type of high-risk BVR shot? Comment your detailed analysis below. The strategic consequences became visible within days. Russian strike aviation operating over southern Ukraine shifted its approach profiles markedly. Evidence, analysis of subsequent flight patterns suggested that Russian planners recognized their cap fighters were now operating without the full picture the A-50U had provided. Su-34 strike pairs that had previously operated with the confidence of comprehensive radar coverage from the Mainstay became more cautious, less willing to penetrate deeply into Ukrainian airspace. Russian fighter patrols began avoiding certain sectors where, without AWACS support, they felt exposed. Ukrainian Air Force planners had anticipated this effect and were ready to exploit it. In the days following the Azov engagement, Ukrainian aircraft operated in southern corridors that had previously been too dangerous. The change was real and measurable. Strike missions that would have required extreme low-level routing under A-50U coverage could now be flown with slightly more altitude, extending their effective range and reducing crew fatigue and airframe stress. But honest assessment demands acknowledging the limits of the achievement. Russia had adapted after previous A-50U losses. They would adapt again. Alternative solutions to the loss of airborne early warning coverage, increased reliance on ground-based radar networks, repositioning of remaining assets further from the engagement zone, potential future deployment of assets from partner nations, were all considerations Ukrainian planners had to account for in follow-on planning. The engagement had bought time and tactical advantage. It hadn't permanently solved the problem. That reality speaks to something important about modern warfare that this engagement illustrates better than almost any other single event in the conflict. Advantage in high-technology warfare is iterative and contested, not permanent. Ukraine had identified a gap in Russian procedures, built a complex deception operation to exploit it, executed the engagement with precision, and delivered a devastating blow to a critical Russian capability. Russia would learn from it. Russian procedures would change. The escort gap that Sokil had exploited would never exist again in the same form. Ukraine, in turn, was already analyzing what those procedural changes would look like and how they could be exploited in the next iteration. The technology underlying the AIM-120 AMRAAM deserves closer examination here, because the missile's performance in this engagement wasn't accidental or lucky. It was the product of a weapons system specifically designed for exactly this type of engagement. The AMRAAM family began development in the 1970s as a replacement for the older AIM-7 Sparrow, which required the launching aircraft to maintain continuous radar lock on the target throughout the missile's flight, a dangerous constraint that forced pilots to fly predictably and expose themselves to enemy fire for extended periods. The AMRAAM's fire-and-forget capability was a transformative development. The missile carries its own active radar seeker, guided by inertial navigation during mid-course flight, and then activating its own seeker for terminal homing. The launching aircraft can break off immediately after firing. The AIM AIM-120D variant that Ukrainian sources indicate was used in this engagement incorporates improvements to range, a two-way data link allowing target updates from the launching aircraft during mid-course flight, and enhanced resistance to electronic countermeasures. Critical against a target like the A-50U, whose electronic warfare suite was specifically designed to defeat missile seekers. The two-way data link capability was particularly relevant here because Sokil could provide target updates during the missile's early flight phase even while beginning his descent, maintaining a firing solution against a target that was beginning evasive maneuvers. The AIM-120D's extended range performance in this engagement reflects careful attention to launch parameters. Range isn't simply a fixed number, it's a function of the target's range, altitude difference, speed, aspect, and the missile's own energy state at launch. By climbing rapidly before firing, Sokil had maximized the missile's initial energy and given it an altitude advantage that extended its effective range significantly. The flight profile wasn't improvised. It was the product of precise calculation and thorough preparation. There is one detail that emerged in the aftermath of the engagement that deserves attention, because it speaks to the human dimension of operations that pure tactical analysis sometimes obscures. The A-50U crew had apparently been operating on this orbit pattern long enough that they had developed routine confidence in their security. Russian ground controllers who debriefed the escort pilots after the engagement reportedly expressed that no threat assessment had indicated the A-50U was at elevated risk during that particular mission. The orbit positioning had been adjusted after previous incidents, and Russian planners believed the aircraft was operating at a safe standoff distance. That confidence, the conviction that previous precautions were sufficient, is one of the most dangerous states in military operations. It suppresses the vigilance that might catch a developing threat. It makes pattern recognition invisible to the people generating the pattern. The A-50U crew's routine had become their vulnerability. The moment their orbit became predictable, a patient, skilled adversary could begin building the engagement. Ukrainian planners had been patient. They had been systematic. They had waited for exactly the right combination of conditions. The refueling gap, the decoy profile activating Russian attention in the wrong direction, the orbit position bringing the A-50U into kinematic range of the AMRAAM launch profile. When all those factors aligned simultaneously, they moved. That discipline, the willingness to collect intelligence for weeks rather than attempt a premature engagement, reflects a level of operational maturity that represents one of Ukraine's most significant developments across the full-scale invasion. Early in the conflict, Ukrainian forces sometimes acted on incomplete information under time pressure. The results were mixed. The subsequent development of more systematic intelligence-driven targeting, informed by Western methodology and Ukrainian innovation, has produced a different kind of military. One that identifies high-value targets, builds comprehensive plans, waits for the right moment, and executes with precision. This engagement was a product of that evolution. Will Russia find a way to restore its airborne early warning coverage over southern Ukraine within the time frame that matters for current operations? Comment yes or no. The answer shapes the entire air campaign calculation for the months ahead. The lessons of the Azov engagement extend beyond the specific technical details. At the strategic level, the engagement demonstrates that no high-value asset is permanently safe if it operates on a predictable schedule within reach of an adversary willing to invest the time and resources to exploit that predictability. The A-50U's orbit had been adjusted to keep it beyond the range of Ukrainian ground-based systems. The adjustment addressed the known threat and created a false sense of security against emerging threats. In this case, an F-16 with an extended-range AMRAAM executing a precisely calculated intercept profile. At the tactical level, the engagement is a study in using deception to create temporary windows of vulnerability in an adversary's defensive posture. The MiG-29 decoy and electronic warfare activation package didn't need to fool Russian controllers for long. They needed to divert attention for the 12 to 15 minutes that Sokil required to climb, fire, and egress. That brief window was sufficient. The deception was tailored to what Russian controllers were already expecting to see, making it more credible than any generic deception would have been. At the operational level, the engagement illustrates the compounding effect of attrition on specialized high-value assets. Russia's A-50U fleet had already been reduced before this engagement. Each loss makes the remaining aircraft more precious, forces them into more conservative operating patterns, and paradoxically makes them more predictable, because conservative patterns are constrained patterns. A commander who must protect an irreplaceable asset has fewer options than one who can accept some risk of loss. Ukraine had understood this and had been systematically working to reduce the A-50U fleet's operational utility for longer than this engagement might suggest. The Sea of Azov is quieter now. Russian air defense radars still sweep the southern Ukrainian sky. Su-35S patrols still fly their assignments. But those patrols are different now, a little more cautious, operating with a gap in their awareness that no ground-based system can fully replace. The picture that Russian cap fighters see is less complete. The confidence they once felt is diminished. And somewhere in that changed calculus, Ukrainian pilots who previously had to hug the deck on every mission are finding, carefully and incrementally, a little more room to operate. Real tactics, real consequences. Conflict East. Now, the answers you've been waiting for. The tactical quiz from earlier in the video. How many AIM-120 AMRAAMs did the F-16 carry into this engagement? The answer is A2 AMRAAMs. The aircraft carried a total of 4 air-to-air missiles, 2 AIM-120D AMRAAMs on the shoulder pylons for the primary BVR engagement, and 2 AIM-9X Sidewinders for close-range contingency defense. Only 1 AMRAAM was fired. The second was retained for self-defense egress in case the engagement had developed differently and an escort fighter had achieved a firing position during Sokil's egress. The decision to carry only 2 AMRAAMs rather than a heavier BVR load reflected the weight and drag optimization required to achieve the climb performance the attack profile demanded. Every kilogram of additional payload reduced the kinematic energy available to the missile at launch. The loadout was a calculated compromise. 3 questions to close this analysis. Was the single-ship intercept the right tactical choice? Or would a 2-ship formation have provided better operational insurance? Perhaps a second aircraft holding in the egress corridor for cover. Even at the cost of increased signature that might have compromised the deception? Could Russian air defense planning have prevented this engagement? The escort refueling gap was a known procedural pattern. Could a different escort rotation schedule, or a dedicated permanent close escort that refueled in pairs rather than both aircraft simultaneously, have closed the vulnerability that Ukrainian planners exploited? And most directly, what would you have done differently if you were the Ukrainian operations planner constructing this engagement? Was there a higher value target profile that could have been layered onto the same deception package? Were there additional steps that could have increased the probability of success or reduced the risk to the F-16 crew? Drop your analysis in the comments. This community runs on the kind of serious tactical thinking that most audiences cannot bring to these questions. And we read everything. Subscribe to Conflict East, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Sea of Azov is quiet now. Fragments of a rotodome somewhere on the seabed. A debris field that GPS and OSINT have partially mapped but never fully recovered. The Mainstay's radar will never spin again over that water. Silent reminders that in modern warfare, the most dangerous moment is the moment you believe you are safe. The moment the orbit becomes routine. The moment the escorts fly to their refueling anchor and someone on the other side has been counting the minutes. Stay vigilant.